My name is Hannah Reyes, and I am 34 years old, and I wrote my father's eulogy 3 weeks before he died, sitting beside his hospital bed at 2 in the morning, because he asked me to, and because I am the kind of person who finishes things before they're due. I want you to understand exactly how that eulogy came to exist, because the order of events matters more than almost anything else in this story. My father, Robert Reyes, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before he passed. In the final 6 weeks, when the hospice nurses started using the specific gentle language they use when they want a family to understand something without saying it directly, he asked me, on a Tuesday night, holding my hand with considerably less strength than he'd had even the week before, whether I would write something for the service. Not because he wanted to dictate his own funeral. Because, he said, smiling in the particular tired way he smiled by then, "You're the one who actually knows how to say things, Han. Your brother talks. You write." So I wrote it. I sat in a vinyl recliner beside his bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, and over the course of 3 nights, I built 4 minutes and 12 seconds of language about a man who fixed other people's plumbing for 31 years and never once, in my entire life, missed a single one of my softball games, even the away games 2 hours up the interstate, even the year his own father was dying, and he still somehow made it to every single one. I wrote about the specific sound of his truck pulling into the driveway at 6:15 every evening, a sound so consistent across my childhood that I could tell you, even now, the exact pitch of that engine. I wrote about his hands. I wrote about the way he said, "All right then," instead of goodbye, like every parting was just a comma instead of a period. I sent it to my brother David 8 days before the funeral, because he was the one delivering it. Not because David asked to write something. He hadn't written a single word of it, not one sentence, not one comma. But because David is older and louder and has always been in our family's unspoken arithmetic, the one who stands at the front of rooms. I sent it to him in an email with the subject line, "Dad's Eulogy. Let me know if you want changes." And David wrote back 4 words. "Looks good. I'll deliver." I want to be precise about what those 4 words meant to me at the time, because I think it matters for understanding how completely I misread the situation. I thought he meant he would read what I'd written, out loud, at the service, the way you'd read someone else's words when you've been asked to perform a task you didn't have the bandwidth or the words yourself to handle. I did not understand, until I was sitting in the second pew of St. Augustine's, with my mother's hand gripped tight in mine, that David had a slightly different plan. He stood at the podium in a gray suit our father had actually liked, and he opened a single folded sheet of paper, and he started speaking. And for the first 11 seconds, I felt something close to relief. There was my father's truck. There was 6:15. There was, "All right then," my own words, coming out of my brother's mouth in my brother's voice, landing exactly the way I'd hoped they would land on a room full of people who loved him. It took me almost a full minute to notice what David was doing with his free hand. He kept gesturing toward himself. Small, almost unconscious gestures. A hand pressed briefly to his own chest on the line about never missing a softball game, even though David has never once, in his adult life, attended one of my games. Because David moved to Phoenix for work the year I started high school, and came back twice a year for holidays. A slight nod toward himself on the line about the hands, the plumbing, the 31 years, as though some quiet physical agreement was being established in the room. This man in front of you, the one speaking, is the son who shared all of this with his father. He never said, "My sister wrote this." He never glanced toward the second pew. He delivered 4 minutes and 12 seconds of my memories, my sentences, my specific recollection of a sound an engine makes at 6:15 in the evening, and he let 200 people in that church absorb every single word of it as his own. I sat very still beside my mother, the way I have learned, across years of watching my family operate, to sit very still when something is happening that I don't yet have language for. I want to describe what I felt, because I think it's more complicated than simple anger. I felt something closer to a kind of vertigo, the specific disorientation of watching your own memory of your own father, words you built at 2 in the morning beside his actual hospital bed, get narrated back to a room of mourners by someone who hadn't been in that room at all. I told myself, sitting there, that it didn't matter. That grief makes you generous about things that wouldn't matter in any other circumstance. That today was about my father, and not about whose name sat on whose sentences. That I could let this one thing go because letting things go was, frankly, the only skill our family had ever consistently asked of me. I was wrong about how small this was going to stay. The reception was held in the function hall behind the church, the kind of room with folding tables and a coffee urn the size of a small appliance, and a slideshow of my father's life looping silently on a projector screen. Birthday parties, fishing trips, his wedding to my mother in 1987, looking impossibly young in a suit 2 sizes too big. I was standing near the dessert table with my Aunt Patricia, holding a paper plate I hadn't touched, when David walked to the front of the room, picked up the small portable microphone the funeral coordinator had used earlier to announce the order of service, and tapped it twice. I want to tell you that I had some premonition in that moment, some cold, settling feeling the way I'd later come to recognize in myself during far more serious confrontations. I didn't. I genuinely believed, for the 3 or 4 seconds before he started speaking, that he was going to thank people for coming. That is how little I expected what actually happened next. "I just want to say something," David said, and the room's low murmur of conversation thinned out the way rooms do when someone holds a microphone with the specific posture of a person about to make an announcement rather than offer a thank you. "Some of you may have noticed my sister Hannah is here today." I felt my aunt's hand find my arm. "I think it's important," David continued, his voice carrying that particular practiced calm men use when they want cruelty to sound like reluctant honesty. "For everyone to know that Hannah hasn't really been part of this family for a long time. She wasn't there for Dad the way the rest of us were, and going forward, I don't think it's fair to either of us to keep pretending otherwise." The room did not gasp. I want to be exact about that, because I think the absence of drama is actually the most accurate detail. 200 people simply went very quiet, the specific quiet of an audience that has just watched something happen that it doesn't yet have permission to react to, waiting to see what the people closest to it would do. I set my paper plate down on the dessert table, very carefully, the way you set down something you suddenly understand you might otherwise drop, and I looked at my brother standing at the front of the room, holding a microphone he had used 20 minutes earlier to deliver 4 minutes and 12 seconds of my own private memories of our father, as though they were his. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically cold moving through my chest, that this had not been a single careless moment. This had been a plan, and the eulogy had only been the first part of it. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, not him, not his wife Vanessa standing 3 feet behind him with an expression I would spend the next several months thinking about, not the 200 people now watching me with the specific, careful pity reserved for a woman who has just been humiliated in public, was that 6 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the hospice nurse had stepped out of the room, my father had pressed a sealed envelope into my hand and said, in a voice that had already started to go quiet and thin by then, "Just in case anybody ever tries to tell you who you are to this family, Han, open it if you ever need to. Not before." I had not opened it. I had not needed to. Not in 6 months. Not through the funeral planning. Not through any of it. I needed to now. To understand why my father handed me a sealed envelope on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, you have to understand what the previous 14 months had actually looked like inside that house. Not the version my family would later tell at receptions, but the real one. The one measured in hours nobody was counting except me. I am a probate paralegal. I want to explain what that means in practice, because it matters for almost everything that happens later in this story. I spend my professional life inside other families' worst moments, reading wills after funerals, reconciling estate inventories, explaining to grieving adult children why the house didn't go where they assumed it would. I have sat across conference tables from at least 200 people, experiencing the specific, disorienting grief of discovering that a parent's final wishes were not what they'd been told. I had no idea, 14 months before my father's diagnosis, how directly that professional training was about to apply to my own family. When Dad got sick, David was 3 hours away in Phoenix, running a regional sales territory for a building supply company, a job he genuinely loved and genuinely worked hard at. And I want to be fair about that, because I think it's important not to make him a cartoon. David wasn't lazy. David was busy, in the specific, defensible way that lets a person be physically absent from something difficult, while still believing, completely, that he was carrying his share of it. I live 4 blocks from the house I grew up in. I want you to sit with that detail, because it's the entire structural reason everything that follows happened the way it did. 4 blocks meant I was the one who drove Dad to chemo on Tuesdays and Fridays for the first 6 months. 4 blocks meant I was the one who sat with him through 11 hours total across 3 different hospital admissions, filling out the forms that ask the same questions every single time, as though hospitals have collectively agreed never to write anything down. 4 blocks meant I was the one who learned, because someone had to learn it, and my mother's hands shook too badly by then to manage it herself, exactly how to draw up his medication doses, and exactly which pharmacy actually kept the specialty prescriptions in stock. David called every Sunday. I want to be precise about that too, because I think the specific, regular nature of it is actually the saddest detail in this entire account. He called every single Sunday, for 40 minutes, sometimes longer, and he was, in those calls, genuinely warm, genuinely funny, genuinely the son our father had raised him to be on the phone. He flew in for 6 visits across 14 months. Thanksgiving, 2 long weekends, the week of the surgery, the week we thought was going to be the end in October and turned out not to be, and finally, the actual end in March. 6 visits in 14 months, while I logged, by my own rough count once I started actually counting, somewhere north of 400 hours. I don't think David ever sat down and did that math. I think, in his own mind, built carefully across years of being the firstborn son in a family that had quietly trained him to believe his presence mattered more than his hours, he genuinely believed the 2 of us had shown up for our father in roughly comparable ways. That belief, I would come to understand much later, wasn't malice. It was simply the specific, ordinary blindness of someone who has never once had to keep an actual ledger of his own contributions, because nobody had ever asked him to. I kept a ledger. I want to admit that plainly, because I think it reveals something true about who I am, for better and for worse. 6 weeks into the diagnosis, sitting in a hospital cafeteria at 11 at night because Dad had finally fallen asleep and I had nowhere else to put my hands, I opened a blank document on my phone and started writing down dates. Not for any legal purpose, not at first, just because the act of writing things down has always been the way I make an unbearable thing feel slightly more bearable, the same instinct that makes me good at my job. Dates of appointments, dates of hospital stays, the specific Tuesday in November when Dad, lucid and lighter than he'd been in weeks, told me a story about his own father I'd never heard before, about a fishing trip in 1968 that had nearly drowned them both. It was on a different Tuesday, in February, 6 weeks before he died, that he handed me the envelope. I remember the room with a specificity I haven't lost, even now. The hospice nurse, a kind, efficient woman named Donna, had just stepped out to chart his vitals at the nurses' station down the hall. The television was on with the sound off, some afternoon judge show flickering silently in the corner. My father, who had lost considerable weight by then, who needed help sitting up, reached toward the nightstand drawer with the specific, deliberate effort that every small motion required of him by that point, and pulled out a plain white envelope, sealed, with nothing written on the outside. "I want you to have this," he said. "Don't open it now. Put it somewhere safe, and don't open it unless you need to." I asked him, the way you ask anything in that particular hospital room hush, what it was. "Insurance," he said, and smiled, the tired smile that had become, by then, almost the only expression he had energy left for. "Just in case anybody in this family ever decides to tell a different story than the true one. You'll know when you need it. I trust you to know." I did not push him to explain further. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. By February, my father had very little energy left for conversations that cost him anything, and I had learned, across those 14 months, exactly which questions were worth spending his remaining strength on and which ones could wait. I took the envelope. I drove home that night and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk, underneath old tax documents and a stack of greeting cards I'd never gotten around to throwing away, and I genuinely, for 6 months, almost forgot it was there. I didn't forget what he'd said, though. Just in case anybody in this family ever decides to tell a different story than the true one. I turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the weeks after he died, trying to understand exactly what he'd anticipated, exactly what specific shape of dishonesty he'd been quietly bracing for in those last clear-headed weeks of his life. I understand now that my father, a man who had spent 31 years fixing other people's plumbing, and had therefore spent 31 years being the person other people called when something underneath their house had quietly gone wrong without anyone noticing until it flooded, had developed, somewhere across 8 decades of watching his own family operate, an unusually accurate sense of exactly where the structural weaknesses in his own house actually were. He knew somehow, before any of us did, that the real damage in this family was never going to come from outside. It was going to come from inside the walls, in a place nobody thought to check, until the day it finally gave way. That envelope sat in my desk drawer for 6 months. I did not think about it once during the funeral planning. I did not think about it while David flew in 3 days early to help coordinate, which turned out to mean sitting in our parents' kitchen making phone calls while Vanessa and my mother handled every actual logistical detail. I did not think about it while reviewing, alongside my mother, the will our family's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who had handled my parents' affairs since before I was born, read aloud to the 3 of us, David, my mother, and me, exactly 1 week before the funeral, splitting everything, house and savings, and the small life insurance policy, evenly between David and me, with my mother retaining full use of the house for her lifetime. Exactly the kind of plain, fair arrangement I would have expected from a man who spent his whole life believing fairness was simply what you did, not something you announced. I did not think about that envelope at all, in fact, until I was sitting in my car in the church parking lot 20 minutes after my brother told 200 people I was no longer part of this family, my hand shaking too badly to immediately put the key in the ignition, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror and trying to remember exactly which drawer, underneath exactly which stack of old greeting cards, I had left it. I drove home from that reception without saying goodbye to anyone, which is not something I have ever done in my entire life, and I want to describe exactly what that drive felt like, because I think the specific numbness of it matters for understanding everything that happened once I got there. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to come first, and for me, that afternoon, it didn't. What I felt instead, gripping the steering wheel through 4 miles of familiar streets I could have driven blind, was the same cold, narrow focus I feel at work when a client hands me a stack of estate documents and asks me to explain why something doesn't add up. My brother had just stood in front of 200 mourners holding a microphone and announced, with the calm authority of a man delivering simple fact, that I wasn't part of our family. My hands were not shaking because I was devastated. My hands were shaking because some part of me had already started cataloging exactly what had just happened, in the same clinical sequence I use professionally, and the sheer scale of what I was cataloging had outpaced what my body could process in real time. I got home. I went straight to my desk, the same desk I have had since college, and I opened the bottom drawer, and I moved aside a stack of greeting cards I genuinely had not touched in years. A birthday card from my college roommate, a sympathy card from when our family dog died, the specific small archaeology of a drawer nobody ever cleans out, until my fingers found the plain white envelope, exactly where I'd left it 6 months earlier, slightly softened at the corners from sitting under all that weight. I sat down on the floor of my apartment, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to bury my father that morning, and I opened it. I want to describe what was inside slowly, because I have replayed the experience of reading it, in order, more times than I can count, and the order matters. The first thing I found was a single handwritten page, my father's handwriting, the specific blocky capitals he always used for anything important, the same handwriting from every birthday card and Christmas card he'd ever given me. It wasn't long. It read in full. Hannah, if you're reading this, somebody in this family decided to tell a story that isn't true, and I want you to have the real one. I love your brother. I always have. But I've watched him my whole life believe that showing up sometimes is the same as showing up every time. And I've watched him let other people carry weight he never noticed was heavy. I'm not writing this because I think he'll do something terrible. I'm writing it because I think, someday, somebody close to him might try to make him believe a version of events that's easier than the truth, and I want you to have something solid to stand on if that day ever comes. Whatever happens with the will, whatever anybody says about who did what, you were there. I know you were there. That's not something anybody gets to take from you, but I figured you might need it written down somewhere besides your own memory, because memory is the first thing people try to argue with. All right then. Love you more than you know, Dad. I sat on that floor and read it 3 times before I let myself move to the second item in the envelope, because I needed, I think, to let his actual voice settle into the room before I looked at anything else. The second item was a folded set of pages, 4 of them, stapled at the corner, and I recognized the format immediately, the way you recognize anything you've spent years professionally trained to recognize. It was a copy of his will. Not a draft, a complete, signed, witness document dated 14 months earlier, just 2 weeks after his diagnosis, with Gerald Whitfield's law firm letterhead across the top and 2 witness signatures at the bottom that I didn't immediately recognize. I want to explain why my stomach dropped reading the date, because the date is the single most important detail in this entire story. This document was dated 14 months before his death, early, deliberate, signed while he was still strong enough to drive himself to Gerald's office and sit through a full legal consultation without needing help. The will Gerald had read aloud to the 3 of us, 1 week before the funeral. The will I had sat beside my mother and listened to with no reason whatsoever to doubt it, was dated 4 months before my father died. 10 months after this one. I went and got my laptop. I want to describe what I did next with the same precision I'd used describing it to a colleague, because that precision is, I think, the only reason any of what follows actually worked. I laid both documents side by side on my kitchen table. The version from the envelope, 14 months old, and the photocopy Gerald had given my mother of the version he'd read aloud, 4 months old. And I went through them clause by clause, the exact way I do for a living. The way I have done for 200 grieving families who walked into our office convinced something didn't add up and needed someone with actual training to confirm whether their instinct was right or whether grief was simply making them paranoid. The early version, the one my father had hidden in an envelope and told me to open only if I ever needed it, split everything evenly between David and me, with our mother retaining lifetime use of the house. Exactly the plain, fair arrangement I would have expected from him. Exactly what I'd believed, 1 week earlier, was the actual will. The later version, the one Gerald had read aloud, the one everyone in that room, including me, had simply accepted as my father's true and current wishes, gave the house outright to David, immediately, not contingent on our mother's lifetime use, with a single line stating that this provision reflected the substantial care and support provided by David Reyes during the testator's final illness. I read that line 4 times. The substantial care and support provided by David Reyes during the testator's final illness. David, who had flown in 6 times across 14 months. David, who had called every Sunday for 40 minutes and genuinely meant every warm word of those calls, but had logged, by any honest accounting, somewhere under 40 actual hours of physical presence across an entire year of dying. I am not a litigator. I want to be clear about the limits of my own expertise, because I think honesty about what I didn't know yet matters as much as honesty about what I did. I am a paralegal who processes estate documents, who has watched enough will contests unfold across a conference table to understand the shape of one, but who had never, in 8 years of this career, been the person standing on the other side of that table with her own father's name at the top of the page. What I did know, looking at those two documents laid side by side on my kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night, still in my black funeral dress, was this. Somewhere between February of last year and 4 months ago, my father's will had changed in a way that directly, specifically contradicted his own handwritten note, written in his own blocky capitals, explaining exactly why he'd hidden the earlier version in the first place. And the only people who had been in that house, managing his care, managing his paperwork, managing every single visit from every attorney and notary who came through that door during the final stretch of his illness, when my mother's hands shook too badly to hold a pen steady, and I was occupied driving him to appointments and measuring out medication doses, were David, on his increasingly frequent visits in those final months, and his wife Vanessa, who had moved in for what she'd called an extended stay to help out, almost 5 months before he died. I picked up my phone. It was 9:40 at night, the day of my father's funeral, and I had exactly one question I needed answered before I let myself feel anything else. I searched the two witness names at the bottom of the later will, the one Gerald had read aloud, the one giving David the house outright. The first name belonged to a notary public whose office, according to the address listed beneath her signature, was located inside a strip mall insurance agency 4 blocks from David and Vanessa's house in Phoenix. Not anywhere near Gerald Whitfield's office, not anywhere near my parents' house, 3 hours away from where my father had actually been living and dying. The second name I recognized immediately because I had heard it at least a dozen times across the past year, mentioned warmly, casually, the way you mention a close friend. It was Vanessa's college roommate. I didn't sleep that night, which I think anyone who has ever found a contradiction this large in their own father's will, on the night they buried him, would understand without needing me to explain it further. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 4 in the morning, doing the only thing that has ever genuinely calmed me down in a crisis, which is methodically, professionally, taking something apart piece by piece until I understand exactly how it was built. I want to walk you through what I actually found, because I think the specific mechanics of it matter, not just for this story, but because I genuinely believe, having now lived through it, that understanding exactly how a document like this gets quietly altered is the only real protection any family has against it happening to them. The first thing I did was call Gerald Whitfield's office number, even though it was the middle of the night and I knew I'd be leaving a voicemail, because I wanted my voice on a recorded message with a timestamp, asking specific questions, before I let myself talk to anyone else in my family about what I'd found. I asked him to call me back as soon as possible regarding a discrepancy in my father's estate file, and I want to be honest that I chose that phrase deliberately. Calm, procedural, the language of someone establishing a record rather than someone in crisis, because I had learned enough across 8 years of this career to know that the version of yourself who sounds composed on a recorded line is the version who gets taken seriously later. The second thing I did was go back through 14 months of emails, texts, and calendar entries on my own phone and laptop, building, the same way I'd built the hour count during his illness, a careful timeline of exactly who had been in that house and when, during the specific window between when the early will was signed and when the later one apparently replaced it. What I found was this. My father's diagnosis came in January. He signed the early will, the one in my envelope, in February of that same year, 2 weeks after diagnosis, while he was still driving himself, still working part-time, still entirely himself. David flew in for a long weekend in April, and again for 2 weeks in July, when Dad had his first surgery, and Vanessa, according to a text message my mother had sent me at the time that I now reread with an entirely different understanding, decided to come stay for a while and help out, starting in October. 5 months before he died, the month everything in our family's daily rhythm genuinely did get harder. The second will, the one disinheriting our mother's lifetime use of the house and giving the property outright to David, citing his substantial care and support, was dated the following February, 1 year, almost to the day, after the first one. By that point, Vanessa had been living in my parents' house for 4 months. I want to be precise about something because I think it's the detail that actually convinces a court, more than any emotional account of who showed up and who didn't. A will doesn't update itself. Someone has to draft it. Someone has to schedule the signing. Someone has to arrange for witnesses. And in nearly every case I've ever personally processed at my job, someone close to the testator, a family member, a caregiver, a spouse, is the one who makes the calls, books the appointment, and drives the person to wherever the signing happens, especially once that person is sick enough to no longer be making those arrangements independently. My father, 14 months into a cancer diagnosis, in the specific month his second will was apparently signed, was using a wheelchair for any distance over short hallways and required help getting in and out of a car. He had not driven himself anywhere in 5 months, which meant someone had driven him. 3 hours, presumably, since the notary's office was 4 blocks from David's house in Phoenix, to sign a document that none of us, including my mother, who lived in that house every single day, had ever once heard mentioned. I called my mother at 7 the next morning, the day after the funeral, and I want to describe that call carefully, because I had decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that whatever I'd found, I was not going to spring it on her the way David had sprung his announcement on me. I asked her gently, over coffee she made with hands still trembling from grief and exhaustion, whether she remembered your father ever traveling to Phoenix in the past year, for any reason, any appointment, anything at all. She thought about it for a long moment, and then she said something that confirmed exactly what I'd already started to suspect. "There was one trip," she said slowly. "Last February. David came and got him for what he said was a special doctor's appointment, some specialist Vanessa had found in Phoenix, who was supposedly the best in the country for his specific kind of pancreatic case. They were gone 2 nights. I remember because it was the only time in the whole illness your father went anywhere without me, and I was a little hurt about it at the time, honestly. But Dad said David really wanted to handle it himself, said it would mean a lot to him, and I didn't want to take that away from either of them." I asked her if she remembered the name of the specialist, or the clinic, or anything written down about the appointment itself. She didn't. There was no follow-up scheduled, no records transferred, nothing in any of his subsequent medical paperwork referencing a Phoenix consultation at all. I checked over the following days with his actual oncology team, the doctors who had managed every real stage of his treatment, and none of them had any record of a referral to Phoenix, any communication with a Phoenix specialist, or any reason to believe such an appointment had ever existed. There had been no specialist. There had been a 2-night trip to Phoenix, during which my father, 3 hours from home, exhausted and trusting his own son to be managing the logistics of his care, had signed a document in a strip mall notary's office that disinherited his own wife's right to live in her own home, 4 blocks from where that son lived, witnessed by that son's own wife's college roommate. I sat with that for a long time before I let myself feel the next thing, which was not, primarily, rage at David. I want to be honest about what I actually felt, because I think it's more useful than the simple villain story would be. I felt, more than anything, a specific grief for my father. For a man who had been so worried 14 months before this happened that someone in his family might someday try to tell a different story than the true one, that he had hidden evidence of his own real intentions in an envelope and trusted his daughter to keep it safe, and who had then, in his final weakened months, been driven 3 hours by the son he loved and trusted completely, to sign away the very protection he'd tried to put in place for the wife he'd been married to for 37 years. I don't know, and I will never fully know, exactly what David told him in that car, or in that notary's office, to make signing that document feel reasonable, necessary, even loving. I have my professional suspicions, built from 8 years of watching how these conversations typically go, the gentle, persistent framing of, "We just want to make sure the house stays in the family properly," the quiet implication that paperwork updates are simply responsible planning, the specific vulnerability of a dying man who wants, more than almost anything in his remaining months, to believe his children are not fighting over what comes after him. What I do know is this. I had, sitting on my kitchen table at 4 in the morning, a signed, dated, handwritten letter in my father's own words explaining exactly why an earlier version of his will existed, and exactly why he didn't trust whatever might replace it. I had a notarized document that contradicted his own stated wishes, executed under circumstances that included no verifiable medical purpose for the trip during which it was signed, witnessed by someone with a direct personal relationship to the family member who benefited most. And I had, sitting 3 hours away in Phoenix, a brother who had just stood in front of 200 mourners and announced with total confidence that I was no longer part of this family. David believed, I would come to understand over the following weeks, that he had already won, that the will was filed, the house was his, and the worst thing that could happen now was an emotionally messy family argument that would eventually exhaust itself the way these things always had before. He had no idea what was sitting in an envelope in my desk drawer for the past 6 months. He had no idea, calling me 3 days later with the specific, casual confidence of a man who has never once had to defend his own paperwork, exactly what he was about to walk into. David called me 3 days after the funeral, on a Thursday evening, and I want to describe the tone of that call carefully, because the specific quality of his confidence is, I think, the most revealing detail in this entire story. He did not call to apologize for the reception. I want to establish that clearly up front, because I think most people assume, hearing a story like this, that there must have been some moment of contrition, some recognition on his part that announcing your sister wasn't family anymore in front of 200 mourners was, at minimum, a cruel way to handle whatever grievance he believed he had. There wasn't. David called the way you call someone to tie up a loose end, brisk and faintly impatient, the specific tone of a man who believes the difficult part of a process is already behind him. "Hannah," he said when I picked up, "I wanted to talk through next steps. With the house, the estate stuff. I think it's better if we keep this simple and not drag it out." I asked him what he meant by next steps. "Gerald's going through probate filing now," he said. "It's straightforward. The will's clear. I just want us to be adults about this, and not make Mom's life harder than it already is." I want to tell you that I felt my professional training take over in that exact moment, the specific narrowing of focus I'd felt in the church parking lot 3 days earlier, because I had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours after finding that envelope, that I was not going to reveal what I knew over the phone, in an unplanned moment where David could control the pacing of his own response. I had learned enough, across 8 years of watching estate disputes unfold, to understand that the person who reveals their full hand first in a conversation like this is rarely the person who walks away with the advantage. "What do you mean the will's clear?" I said, keeping my voice level, curious rather than confrontational. "Walk me through it. I want to understand exactly what you think is happening." David, who has never once in his life been able to resist explaining something he believes he already understands better than the person asking, told me. He told me, with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone reciting a story he'd clearly told himself many times already, that Dad had decided, sometime in the past year, that it made the most sense for the house to go to David outright, since David and Vanessa would be the ones actually positioned to maintain a property like that long term, and since I, as he put it, had my own life going on, and probably wouldn't want the burden of an aging house 3 hours from where I actually lived. I asked him, still keeping my voice exactly where it needed to be, when exactly Dad had made that decision. "Last year," David said. "He talked to me about it when I came to get him for that specialist appointment. Said he'd been thinking about it for a while." "What specialist appointment?" I said. There was a pause, brief, almost nothing, but I have spent 8 years learning to hear the specific texture of a pause that means someone has just realized they're being asked a question they hadn't prepared an answer for. "In Phoenix," David said. "The oncology specialist Vanessa found. I told you about this." "You didn't," I said. "Mom mentioned a trip. She didn't have a name for the specialist or any record of a referral. I checked with his actual oncology team. Nobody there has any record of a Phoenix consultation, any referral to Phoenix, or any communication with a specialist in Phoenix at all." The pause that followed that sentence was considerably longer than the first one. "I don't know what you want me to say to that." David said finally, his voice shifting very slightly into something defensive rather than brisk. Maybe it wasn't formally referred. Vanessa found him through a personal connection. It doesn't change what Dad decided while he was there. What did he decide exactly? I said. Tell me the specific thing he told you, in his own words, that you believe justifies a new will signed during a trip with no medical record, witnessed by your wife's college roommate, at a notary's office 4 blocks from your house. I want to describe the silence on the other end of that call, because I think it lasted almost 10 full seconds, an eternity in a phone conversation, and I let it sit there without filling it, the same way I let silences sit across a conference table at work, when I want the other side to understand exactly how much I already know. How do you know about the will? David said. His voice had lost every trace of brisk confidence by then. Gerald hasn't filed anything yet. Nobody's seen the actual document except... He stopped himself. I think in that exact moment, he realized what he was about to confirm out loud. Except who, David? I said. I'm not doing this over the phone, he said, his voice climbing now, the specific rising pitch of a man who has just felt the ground shift underneath a story he believed was already settled. Whatever you think you found, you're misunderstanding it. Dad wanted this. He told me himself. I have a letter in his own handwriting, I said, explaining exactly why he hid an earlier version of his will, dated 14 months before he died, splitting everything evenly between us, with Mom keeping the house for her lifetime. I have that earlier will, signed and witnessed properly, at Gerald's actual office. And I have a second will, dated 1 year later, that contradicts everything in that letter, signed during a trip nobody can verify the medical purpose of, witnessed by a woman whose only documented connection to this family is being your wife's college roommate. The line was quiet again, but differently this time. Not the texture of a man caught off guard, but something closer to a man doing rapid math he didn't expect to need to do. You don't know what you're talking about, David said finally, but the conviction had gone out of it. Dad wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he was signing. I'm sure he believed he did, I said. I'd like to know exactly who explained it to him, and exactly what they said, before he signed it 3 hours from home, with no one in this family aware the trip was happening for any reason other than a doctor's appointment that apparently never existed. This is exactly why I said what I said at the reception, David said, and his voice had shifted again into something colder, something closer to the version of him I'd heard at that microphone. You always do this. You always have to be the one who knows more than everybody else, who has to dig and dig until you find some way to make yourself the only person who actually cared. Dad loved both of us. He made his choice. You don't get to undo it just because you didn't like the answer. I want to tell you what I felt hearing that, because I think it's important. I did not feel destroyed by it. I had, by that point, 3 days into understanding exactly what had actually happened in that notary's office, stopped expecting David to suddenly become a different person than the one who'd stood at a microphone and erased me from our family in front of 200 witnesses. What I felt instead was the specific, clarifying confirmation of exactly who I was dealing with, and exactly how far he was prepared to go to protect a version of events that benefited him. I'm going to ask you one more time, I said, and I want you to actually think about the answer before you give it to me. Who set up the appointment in Phoenix that Dad believed he was attending? There was another long silence. Vanessa handled the logistics, David said finally. She knows the area. She found the notary. I don't see what difference it makes who handled logistics. Dad signed it. Dad wanted it. It makes a difference, I said, because the notary your wife found, who witnessed your father signing away your mother's right to her own home, turns out to be her college roommate. And I think a court is going to find that detail considerably more interesting than you currently believe it is. I hung up before he could respond, not out of anger, but because I had gotten the one piece of information I'd called to get, confirmed directly from his own mouth on a line I had by then already started recording on my phone's voice memo app the moment he picked up. A practice, I want to be honest, isn't always admissible, depending on the state, but one I'd learned, across 8 years in this field, to default to anyway, because you never know in advance which conversation is going to be the one that matters. David believed, hanging up that phone, that he had simply weathered an uncomfortable confrontation with a sister who, in his mind, had always needed to feel like the smartest person in any room. What he didn't understand, walking back to whatever evening he resumed on the other side of that call, was that I now had a recorded admission that his wife had personally arranged the trip, personally found the notary, and personally selected the witness. 3 facts that transformed what I'd been quietly building from a grieving daughter's suspicion into something with an actual name in the legal world I worked in every single day. A pattern. Documented, dated, and now finally confirmed out loud by the one person who'd had every reason to keep it vague. I called my own attorney the next morning. I want to explain why I didn't simply handle this myself, given everything I do professionally, because I think it's an important distinction, and one I had to sit with carefully before I made the call. I am a paralegal. I have spent 8 years preparing the documents, organizing the exhibits, and managing the procedural machinery behind will contests, but I have never once stood in front of a judge, and I had learned enough from watching skilled attorneys work to understand the specific danger of believing that proximity to a profession is the same thing as competence in it. The family member who tries to litigate her own father's estate, no matter how much she understands about the process, becomes, in front of a court, exactly what David had already tried to make me look like at that reception. Too personally invested to be trusted. So on a Friday morning, 6 days after the funeral, I drove 40 minutes to the office of an estate litigation attorney named Patricia Okafor, a woman I had worked alongside professionally on 2 prior cases years earlier. Someone whose reputation in our local legal community rests almost entirely on being unmovable by confident men holding leather folders. I laid everything out for her in the order I'd assembled it. The early will, dated 14 months before Dad's death, splitting everything evenly and preserving our mother's lifetime use of the house. The handwritten letter, explaining in his own words exactly why he'd hidden it. The later will, dated 1 year afterward, disinheriting that lifetime use and granting the property outright to David, citing his substantial care and support during the final illness. The unverifiable Phoenix trip, with no medical referral, no record at his actual oncology practice, no follow-up appointment ever scheduled. The notary, 4 blocks from David's house, who turned out to be Vanessa's college roommate. And the recorded call, 3 days old, in which David confirmed, in his own voice, that Vanessa had personally arranged the trip, personally found the notary, and personally selected the witness. Patricia listened the way good attorneys listen, without interrupting, and when I finished, she said the thing that mattered most. "This isn't a question of whether your father had the right to change his will," she said. "People are allowed to change their minds, even at the end of their lives, even in ways their other children don't like. What you're describing isn't a man changing his mind. It's a pattern that has a name in this field. We call it undue influence, and the law recognizes that a dying person, dependent on someone for transportation, for daily care, for basic logistics, is uniquely vulnerable to having decisions made to look like his own that were actually engineered by someone else entirely." She walked me through exactly what we'd need to prove that, and I want to lay it out the way she did, because I think the precision of it matters more than any emotional account ever could. We needed to establish that David and Vanessa had what the law calls a confidential relationship with my father during the relevant period. Easy enough, given that Vanessa had been living in the house for months, and David had transported him personally to the signing. We needed to show the new will represented an unnatural disposition, a departure from what he'd previously, clearly, and recently expressed in writing, which the envelope, dated and signed in his own hand, established about as cleanly as such evidence ever gets. And we needed to show that the people who benefited had actively participated in procuring the document, rather than simply existing nearby while someone else handled it, which the unverifiable Phoenix trip, the absent medical referral, and David's own recorded admission about who'd arranged the logistics gave us in a combination Patricia said she didn't often see laid out this cleanly, this early in a case. I want to be honest with you about something, Patricia said near the end of that first meeting. Cases like this usually come down to which side can tell the more believable story to a judge who's never met any of these people and has to decide, based entirely on paper, who's lying. What you've handed me isn't a story. It's a timeline with dates that don't move, a letter in his own handwriting that we can authenticate, and a recorded statement from the opposing party confirming the exact facts that make this case. That's not a typical Tuesday in this field. Most families just have feelings and competing memories. You have receipts. We filed a formal will contest the following week. A will contest, for anyone who hasn't had the particular education of watching this process from inside an estate law office, being a legal proceeding in which an interested party formally challenges a will's validity in probate court, asking a judge to set it aside in favor of an earlier, valid version, on grounds that can include exactly the kind of undue influence Patricia had identified. We filed it in the county where my father had lived and died, attaching the early will, the handwritten letter, an affidavit from my mother regarding her memory of the unexplained Phoenix trip, and a formal request for discovery into the circumstances surrounding the later will's execution, meaning, in practical terms, that David and Vanessa would now be legally required to produce records, answer questions under oath, and account in a courtroom rather than a phone call for exactly what had happened during that trip. Patricia also did something I hadn't anticipated, which turned out to matter enormously. She filed what's called a lis pendens against the property, a public notice recorded with the county, alerting anyone who might search the title that the property's ownership was currently in active legal dispute. I want to explain why that detail matters as much as it does, because it's the exact mechanism, I'd come to learn, that turns a quiet family disagreement into something the other side can no longer simply ignore. A lis pendens doesn't just sit in a file somewhere. It attaches to the title itself, which means no bank will issue a mortgage against that property, no title company will ensure a sale, and no buyer's attorney doing basic due diligence will ever miss it. David could not quietly refinance the house, could not quietly sell it, could not do anything at all with the property that benefited from anyone outside our immediate family failing to notice the dispute. I learned, 2 weeks later, exactly how quickly that detail found its way back to him. Because David's attorney, a man Patricia had dealt with twice before and described with the specific, weary precision of someone who has beaten an opponent's strategy more than once, as aggressive in meetings and considerably less aggressive once discovery actually starts, called requesting an emergency conference, the legal equivalent, Patricia told me, of someone realizing the ground underneath their feet had just been recorded as disputed in a public database that anyone, including David's own mortgage lender, could now find with a simple search. It turned out David had, in fact, already started the process of refinancing the house 6 weeks earlier, intending to pull equity out for what his attorney's filing referred to, almost too perfectly, as business investment purposes. A phrase that, once I read it, sent me back through David's recent Sunday calls with an entirely different ear, remembering a vague, breezy mention weeks earlier about looking into some opportunities that I'd barely registered at the time, the way you barely register weather small talk. The refinancing had stalled the moment the lender's title search came back flagged. David could not borrow against a house whose ownership a court was actively being asked to reverse. I want to tell you what I felt learning that detail, sitting across from Patricia in her office with a printout of the title search results between us. I did not feel triumphant in the simple way satisfying stories tend to suggest. I felt the specific, quiet recognition of watching a structure built entirely on the assumption that nobody would ever check the foundation begin, finally, to reveal exactly how unstable it had been the entire time. David had believed, walking out of that notary's office in Phoenix 14 months ago, that the paperwork was settled, permanent, beyond question. He had believed, standing at a microphone 3 days after burying our father, that announcing I wasn't part of this family would be the end of any resistance he might face. He had no idea, agreeing to that emergency conference, exactly how thoroughly the quiet, methodical part of me, the part our father had apparently trusted more than he'd ever told either of us directly, had already documented every single piece of what he'd done. The emergency conference was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the county courthouse, with both attorneys present and a judge assigned to oversee preliminary motions before the case proceeded to a full hearing. David did not yet know that his own employer, alerted by a routine background verification his company ran annually for employees in financial adjacent roles, had also just received notice of an active property dispute bearing his name. He was about to find that out at work, in front of people who had never once heard the version of our family he delivered at that reception. I didn't find out what happened at David's office the way I found out most things in this story, through careful, deliberate investigation. I found out because his coworker, a woman named Renee, who had met exactly twice at company holiday parties years earlier, and who had, apparently, quietly disliked David's particular brand of confident charm for longer than I'd realized, sent me a message on social media 4 days after the emergency conference was scheduled. The kind of message that opens with, "I don't normally do this, but I think you should know." I want to explain what David's job actually involved, because the specific mechanics of his employer's verification process matter for understanding exactly how this unfolded without anyone in our family orchestrating it directly. David managed a regional sales territory for a building supply company, and as part of an internal compliance review that ran annually for any employee handling vendor contracts and purchasing authority above a certain threshold, the company conducted background and financial standing checks. Not detailed investigations, just basic searches that included, among other things, a property records check on any real estate the employee had recently been involved in transferring, refinancing, or disputing. The lis pendens Patricia had filed 3 weeks earlier came up in that routine check the same week David's company ran its quarterly compliance cycle. According to Renee, David was called into a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon by his regional director and the company's HR compliance officer and asked, in the careful procedural language companies use when they're not yet accusing anyone of anything but want to understand a flagged item, to explain an active legal dispute involving real property under his name that had surfaced in his file. David, by Renee's account, had been visibly thrown by the question, not because there was anything illegal about being a party to a will contest, which there absolutely wasn't, but because he had clearly not anticipated that the lis pendens Patricia filed would surface anywhere outside the narrow world of title searches and mortgage lenders. He came out of that room looking like someone had pulled the floor out from under him, Renee wrote. He told a couple people it was a family misunderstanding being blown out of proportion by my sister. But I watched him take like 4 phone calls in the parking lot over the next hour, and he did not look like a man having a misunderstanding. I want to be honest about what I felt reading that message, because I think it's more complicated than simple satisfaction. I did not feel glad that David was embarrassed in front of his colleagues. What I felt was the specific, sobering recognition that the consequences of what he'd done had finally started moving on their own momentum, independent of anything I was actively doing, the way a properly filed legal record tends to surface in places you never specifically aimed it. Which is, I think, the entire point of filing things properly in the first place, rather than relying on confrontation or persuasion to carry the weight that documentation can carry on its own. The emergency conference itself, the following Tuesday, was almost anticlimactic by comparison, in the specific way I'd learned, across 8 years of watching these proceedings, that the most consequential legal moments often are. There was no dramatic courtroom reveal, no audience of 200 people, no microphone. There was a conference room at the county courthouse, a judge reviewing preliminary motions, 2 attorneys, and the specific quiet procedural rhythm of a system that doesn't care how confident either side feels walking in. Patricia presented the lis pendens, the early will, the handwritten letter, now formally authenticated through a handwriting comparison against other verified samples of my father's writing, and the recorded phone call, which her motion argued was admissible under our state's specific exception for calls where the disclosing party voluntarily reveals incriminating information without prompting. A legal nuance I won't pretend to fully understand the boundaries of myself, but one Patricia had clearly already confirmed before she let me play her that recording weeks earlier. David's attorney argued, predictably, that a dying man retains the absolute right to change his estate plan, that the absence of a documented medical referral didn't prove the trip's purpose was fabricated, and that family disagreements about parental affection shouldn't be litigated as fraud. The judge, a measured woman named Honorable Diane Castellano, who Patricia later told me had a particular reputation for taking elder financial exploitation claims seriously, did not rule on the merits of the case that day. That would come later, at the full hearing. But she did grant something Patricia had specifically requested, an order freezing any further transactions involving the property, formalizing what the lis pendens had already informally accomplished, and a discovery order requiring David and Vanessa to produce, within 30 days, complete documentation of the Phoenix trip, including any medical records, appointment confirmations, payment receipts, or communications referencing the specialist consultation David had described to me on that recorded call. I want to tell you what happened over the following 30 days, because it is, in its own quiet way, the actual climax of this entire story, even though nothing about it would have made for compelling footage at a reception. David and Vanessa could not produce a single document, not one appointment confirmation, not one payment receipt to any medical provider in Phoenix, not one email, text, or piece of correspondence referencing a specialist who, as it turned out, when Patricia's investigator finally located a doctor by the name Vanessa had eventually, reluctantly provided under deposition pressure, had retired from practice 3 years before the supposed appointment and had no record, in his own retained files, of ever having seen a patient named Robert Reyes. There had never been a specialist. There had never been an appointment. There had only ever been a 2-night trip to Phoenix, arranged entirely by Vanessa, ending in a strip mall notary's office 4 blocks from her own house, where a dying man, exhausted from a 3-hour drive, trusting the son he loved completely, signed a document that erased his own wife's right to the home she'd lived in for 37 years. I learned all of this not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, accumulating way discovery actually works. A deposition transcript here, a missing record there, each piece arriving in its own quiet envelope, until the full shape of what had happened was undeniable to anyone looking at the file, including, eventually, David's own attorney, who Patricia told me had grown noticeably less aggressive in settlement discussions with each passing week. The specific behavioral shift she said she'd come to recognize as a lawyer, realizing his client no longer had a case worth fighting for in front of a judge. The full hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. David requested, through his attorney, a settlement conference instead. I agreed to it, not because I had softened toward him, but because Patricia had explained something to me early on that I'd carried with me through every step of this process. The goal was never to destroy my brother. The goal was to make sure my father's actual, documented, handwritten wishes were honored, and to make sure my mother kept the home she'd lived in for 37 years. If David could be made to understand and accept that, without dragging our entire family through a public hearing none of us, including me, actually wanted, that outcome was no less of a victory for being quiet. We met in a conference room, the 4 of us plus both attorneys, on a gray Thursday afternoon, 8 weeks after I'd sat in a church parking lot, trying to remember which desk drawer held an envelope I hadn't opened in 6 months. David looked, when he walked in, considerably smaller than he had standing at that microphone. I want to tell you exactly what that conference room looked like, because I think the ordinariness of it matters more than any dramatic courtroom scene could have. It was a rectangular room on the 3rd floor of Patricia's office building, fluorescent lighting, a long table, a pitcher of water nobody touched, the specific institutional quiet of a space designed for exactly this kind of conversation. 4 people who used to be a family, now arranged around a table with their attorneys, trying to reach an agreement that a courtroom would otherwise have to impose on them. David sat across from me. Vanessa sat beside him, and I want to be honest that I had genuinely wondered in the weeks leading up to that meeting what she would look like once the full weight of what discovery had uncovered finally landed somewhere she couldn't redirect or explain away. She looked tired. Not contrite exactly. I don't think Vanessa is a woman who experiences guilt the way some people do, but tired in the specific way of someone who has spent 2 months watching a plan she'd engineered come apart one missing document at a time. Patricia opened by laying out, calmly and without any theatrical emphasis, exactly what the discovery process had established. No medical referral, no appointment record, a retired doctor with no file matching my father's name, a notary with an undisclosed personal relationship to the family, a recorded admission, already in evidence, confirming who had arranged every piece of the trip. She said it the way she'd told me, weeks earlier. She always preferred to say these things in a settlement room, not as an accusation, but as a simple recitation of facts that left the other side nothing left to argue against except the facts themselves. David's attorney, a man who had clearly already had this exact conversation with his client privately before walking into that room, did not contest a single point. He asked instead what resolution we were prepared to accept. I had thought about this question for weeks, longer than I'd thought about almost anything else in this entire process, because I understood, by that point, that I had genuine leverage to ask for considerably more than what I actually wanted. I could have pushed for the full reversal of the second will, restoring the original even split with our mother retaining the house, and then pursued David separately for the emotional damages of what he'd done at that reception, the public humiliation, the months of legal stress, all of it documentable, all of it, according to Patricia, plausibly successful. I didn't ask for that. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, more than the discovery, more than the recorded call, more than any single piece of evidence we'd built. What I asked for was this. The original will, the one my father had hidden in that envelope specifically because he'd anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal, would be honored in full. The house preserved for my mother's lifetime use. The estate split evenly between David and me upon her passing. The fraudulent later will would be formally voided by court order, on the record, so that there would never be any future ambiguity for anyone, including David's own children someday, about which document represented our father's actual wishes. And David would issue a written retraction of what he'd said at the reception, not delivered publicly, not performed for an audience, but sent in a letter to every single person who had been in that room that day, correcting the record in writing, with his own name on it. I did not ask for money beyond what the original will already provided. I did not ask for an apology delivered in person, because I had learned, across those 8 weeks, that I no longer needed David's sincerity to feel resolved about what had happened. I needed the truth on paper, distributed to the same people who had watched him erase me from our family in front of a microphone, because a private apology changes nothing about what 200 people believe happened, and I had decided that correcting that record mattered more to me than any amount of money or any satisfying confrontation ever could. David agreed. I want to be honest that I don't fully know what he felt agreeing to it, whether it was genuine remorse finally catching up to him, or simply the calculation of a man who understood, by that point, exactly how much worse a full hearing would be for him professionally and personally. Patricia told me, afterward, that it's rarely possible to know which one you're getting in these settlements, and that the wiser approach is to stop needing to know, because the outcome on paper is the same either way. The letters went out 3 weeks later. I received a copy of the one sent to my Aunt Patricia, who forwarded it to me with a single line of her own. I always knew, I'm glad it's finally written down somewhere besides my own memory. I want to tell you what my relationship with David looks like now, because I think people want the clean ending, and I'm not going to pretend this story has one. We are not close. We exchange brief, polite messages around holidays. He has not called on a Sunday since that final confrontational call, and I have not reached out to fill that particular silence, because I have come to understand, across this entire process, that some relationships don't survive a betrayal of this scale simply because the legal paperwork eventually gets corrected. The will was fixed. The truth was put back on the record. My brother and I are still, in the ways that matter most, strangers who happen to share a last name and a complicated, unrepairable history. My mother still lives in that house, the same house with the same driveway where my father's truck used to pull in at 6:15 every evening for 31 years. She knows everything now. I told her the full story, slowly, over several conversations, because I wanted her to understand exactly why the home she'd lived in for 37 years had nearly been taken from her, and exactly why it wasn't going to be. She cried the first time I explained the Phoenix trip in full, not from anger, I think, but from the specific grief of understanding how thoroughly her own husband's final months had been used against the family he'd spent his whole life trying to protect. I still have the envelope. I want to tell you that, because I think it matters more than almost anything else I could say about how this ended. I kept the original, the handwritten letter in my father's own blocky capitals, the one that started with my name and ended with the same 4 words he always used instead of goodbye. I had it professionally preserved, the kind of archival treatment you'd give any document you intend to keep for the rest of your life, and I keep it now in a frame on my own desk, not in a drawer underneath old greeting cards, but somewhere I see it every single day. I think about what he wrote often. That's not something anybody gets to take from you, but I figured you might need it written down somewhere besides your own memory, because memory is the first thing people try to argue with. He was right about that. The way he was right about almost everything across 31 years of fixing other people's plumbing and noticing, long before anyone else did, exactly where the structural weaknesses in a house actually were. Memory is the first thing people try to argue with. Mine was never going to be enough, on its own, to stand against a notarized document and a brother confident enough to announce my absence from our family in front of 200 people who had no reason yet to doubt him. But memory, written down in time, sealed in an envelope and trusted to the right person, turns out to be exactly enough. That's the part I think about most now, more than the courtroom filings, more than the recorded phone call, more than the specific moment David's confidence finally cracked across a conference table. My father didn't leave me power. He left me proof. He understood, in his last clear-headed months, the simple, durable difference between the two. And he trusted me, specifically, quietly, without ever needing to say so directly, to know exactly which one would actually matter when the day finally came. I was there for every single hour of his illness that anyone bothered to count, and in the end it turned out so was he, for me, 4 blocks away, in an envelope, waiting exactly as long as it took.